So today we're going to finish finish up our notes on our unit on evolution. We kind of left off last week talking about the 5 ways that evolution, or the 5 patterns of evolution. We talked about adaptive radiation, um, convergent evolution, divergent evolution, and then coevolution. And today we're going to talk about the evidence that we see that indicates evolution occurs. And again, we're talking about science, so we're looking at scientific evidence here. So some of the evidence that we see, I'm going to try to do this. Some of the evidence that we see are actually, remember when we talked about divergent evolution and those homologous structures? And we kind of described it as all the different mammals of the world that exist, and originally there was just one mammal species, and then it diverged into all of these different mammal species, including elephants and lions, and we said even, of course, humans and bats, which are small rodents that can fly, right? So if we look at the wings, the bones and the wings of a bat, we see they really have the same structures, the same bone structure as even humans do, and all mammals kind of share that same bone structure. So that's an example of homologous structures, and those homologous structures are actually a pretty strong evidence that organisms must have evolved, because why else would all of the mammals, for example, have the same bones in their arms and legs and so forth, and pelvis, and on and on. We also, when we talked about convergent evolution, so animals that really aren't closely related evolutionarily, but they have converged to look more and more similar simply because their habitats are very similar, and they have analogous structures, structures that really arose separately, even though they look very, very similar. So one of the things we talked about were, for example, the wings on a bird compared to the wings on a moth. They're not closely related at all. One's an insect and the other's an animal. So those wings arose separately. They evolved separately in those species. But they're both wings. So that also suggests analogous structures also are evidence of evolution. And the reason that is simply because organisms that have similar environments kind of evolve to have traits that look the same. But if you looked at actual structure really, really closely, the structures are really not alike at all. One more piece of evidence for evolution are vestigial structures. So structures which actually are kind of useless on organisms, but they must have been there. The theory is that they must have been really useful at one point in time. So they probably were useful to our ancestors. And one example of that is the human appendix. The human appendix is a little organ that comes off of our intestines. And we think it was really important back when humans ate more grasses and needed those extra enzymes to break down grasses. And we just kind of don't need that anymore. So we consider the appendix to be a vestigial structure. You can live without it without a problem. Other examples of that, pelvic bones and the stomach that we find in whales. Whales are actually mammals. They actually are mammals that evolved from organisms that used to walk on land. They were kind of a wolf-like organism, actually, and we have found fossils, kind of the various fossils that link those two species in the fossil record. But because whales have pelvic bones and they have stomachs, that these vestigial stomachs that they don't use for anything, and pelvic bones are only used for walking, we would certainly, that would certainly be some evidence that indicated that, yeah, whales must have evolved from organisms that walked on land at one point. Also, snakes can have tiny leg bones inside. I actually used to have a ball python, and you could kind of feel where there were spurs, and those spurs were actually the remnants of tiny leg bones. And then the other evidences are things like embryological development. If we look at organisms, how organisms develop very early on as embryos, there's really a lot of similarities between animals that we really don't think are terribly closely related. And we even see things like on human embryos, kind of the remains of gill slits, if you will, which is kind of like why would we have that? Why would we certainly, you know, have not had gills? But they think it's perhaps just remaining from our very, 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 very long ago ancestors. And then fossil evidence, that we talk about that a lot. As you dig deeper, we see animals that look kind of similar to modern animals, but not exactly. And so it kind of is, and certainly an indication that species have changed over time. And then the very last one, and of course this is the newest evidence that we have for evolution, is we can look at sequences of DNA. And we can actually compare how similar or dissimilar organisms are based on their DNA sequences. One way that we represent how closely related certain species are, and the way that we represent lineages, this is something called a phylogenetic tree. And a phylogenetic tree, you can see, begins with a common ancestor way down on the bottom. And then as we move up our tree, we kind of see where here something called speciation has occurred, where we really have, so we're looking at crocodilians. Here we have branching off, where one branch is going to go in this direction, one branch is going to go in this direction, and they represent animals that are a bit more different from each other. So this line gives rise, the crocodilians give rise to all the birds, modern day birds as we think of them. This lineage doesn't change as much. This becomes crocodiles. And then we have lots of lizards and alligators and things that branch off from that. On a phylogenetic tree, organisms that are very close to each other on the branches are very closely related, as opposed to organisms that are farther away from each other. So if I look at B compared to C, they are not as closely related as A is to B, because they're in very close proximity on the tree itself. And so certainly A and F are not very closely related at all, because the branches representing them are very far away from each other on the tree. And then I just want to talk about the sexual reproduction versus asexual reproduction. And we've talked about this a lot this year, but I want to add a little bit more to it. So we all know that sexual reproduction requires two parents, and the big advantage is that there's genetic diversity in the offspring. Asexual is one parent, offspring are genetically identical. From an evolutionary standpoint, though, when we talk about asexual reproduction, evolution occurs only by mutation. So there's mutations because all the offspring are identical and they only have one parent, that evolution occurs only by mutation in this population. Whereas in the sexually reproducing population, there's mutations here which are important, but there's also some individuals, some offspring who are born with all of the like good genes or the lucky genes in a particular population. And if that truly makes them more fit than some of the rest of the population, they're going to be more likely to survive. So evolution happens faster um, and more efficiently in a sexually reproducing population. Although a lot of times asexually reproducing organisms are, I mean, it's a lot of insects and organisms that can reproduce very rapidly and have really short generation times. So that's one advantage of the asexually reproducing population.